Good evening. This is Mae Brussel. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 739, February the 3rd, 1986. I have one correction to make that I have put on the radio several times and have not been conscious, obviously, of the error. When I think about it, of course, I realize what the situation is. I got a telephone call from Judge Sirica's son, John Sirica, telling me that his father is very much alive. The problem is that I was confusing Senator Sam Ervin of Ervin, I-R-V-I-N, of Watergate, that judge, the one that James McCord gave the message to in 1973, March 73, that broke the story open, with Judge John Sirica, who also handled Watergate matters. And it was Judge John Sirica who turned down the application of advanced genetic sciences for their genetic experiments, their live bacteria, in 1984. He's very much alive. I apologize to him and the family, and that was a confusion with Senator Sam Ervin. Not to be explained, but those things do happen. I will do more on advanced genetic sciences, part 3, next week. I did get a brochure, thanks to a listener, World Watcher, of the employees. I asked their education level because I had an idea that this small group was a dummy front, the Oakland group, for something very much larger, and I started to share with you last week. AGS has 31 people working for them with PhDs. Also, they have a Belgian and Canadian offices. They have the affiliates in Belgium and Canada. Their patent was the first commercial use for genetic bacteria engineered into plant breeding that has been approved by the Environmental Protection Agency. They're 32% owned by their Belgian affiliate, Plant Genetic Systems in Belgium. They're funded by shareholders other than AGS, including research grants from the government. They didn't say in the brochure whether it was the Belgian government or the federal government, but with our CIA controls all over the world, it wouldn't really matter much. It said governmental grants. Rome and Haas Company, according to them, of their own literature, is one of the 4 major shareholders. They didn't list the shareholders, of course, one of the 4 major. Rome and Haas, this outfit was started by an American by the name of Mr. Haas and his partner, Mr. Rome, from Germany. They became partners with I.G. Farben and DuPont before World War II broke out, between the two wars, during the war, and after the war. For those of you that have books such as Treason's Peace and All Honorable Men and many others, you can start looking in the index under Rome and Haas, and I'll share this material with you next week for those of you who don't have it. Treason's Peace has a pretty good description of their intention to work with Nazi Germany after the war was over, when Nazi Germany would control South America. And of course, the great geneticist down there after the war was Joseph Mengele, who walked out with the experiments that he did at Auschwitz in his hand, left Auschwitz in January 1945 and took them to South America. The scientific board includes a Joseph Schell, S-C-H-E-L-L, PhD and director of the Max Planck Institute in Cologne, Germany. And I'll do more next week on the Max Planck group with Nazi Germany, and they're forming the institution, the formal scientific institution in the United States while the war was going on. This is a very important group of people continuing genetic research using Lyme genetic bacteria to test in the agricultural rich lands of the world out here in Monterey County. And this is a continuation of just exactly what I smelled it was before I got into the hard details about the company. I was very suspicious of how quickly they moved. Just to update one story very fast for you, because by the time you get this tape, or you're listening now, in a day or two, the decision to acquit the defendants in the trial in Rome, Italy, will probably have taken place shortly. The Bulgarian connection completely fell apart. This was the trial of the century. There isn't anything to hold it up, and there never was. The Washington Times, Reverend Moon's newspaper, strangely enough, has quite a long article saying there was insufficient evidence of a Bulgarian connection to find these people guilty. They also mentioned that Sergei Antonov, who has been locked up in Rome in a jail since 1982, when he testified he was in a robot-like manner, leaving no strong impression and giving nothing away. Well, he was obviously poisoned. As a matter of fact, when he was on the stand, he said, "I have to leave, I'm sick." And he phased out. His mind was just literally fried. So he's been locked up. This is going on the 4th year, and I hope they release him soon. There was no evidence to lock him up for 4 years. Another reason for acquitting these people, as I've mentioned before, and it's come out in the recent article, Agca changed his testimony just too many times. There was evidence that Agca was clearly manipulated from the outside, and there was also evidence of his link to the Turkish extremist organization, the Grey Wolf Commando. So the point being that when they find that it isn't the Russians or the KGB who wanted to swing the plot to kill the Pope, the Antichrist, killing the religious holy man, they will not prosecute the right wing where it leads, but drop it all together. If they can't find a leftist, they won't find anybody. So that's the update on that story. Well, now I'm going into the space shuttle because that's really the story of the week, and we have to either get into it or wrap it up, which either way you see it, but it made its full cycle for me in about 7 days, and that's all I need to know. I knew within 2 days just about exactly what happened. Incidentally, the Pope let out a couple of doves. They refused to fly, the symbol of peace. He released those January the 20th. The birds wouldn't cooperate. He put them on his hand to launch them into St. Peter's Square, and they wouldn't go back. I think even the doves can smell hypocrisy and refuse to fly for the Pope, and the shuttle refused to fly for Ronald Reagan. Now, there were delays in getting this shuttle off, as you know. Bad weather one day. It was rainy in Africa. That was sandstorm in Africa, and that's where one of the safety places would be if they had any trouble with the shuttle. It was supposed to take off, and it couldn't because the delays were a sandstorm in India, and the next day a sandstorm in Casablanca in Morocco. And by the 3rd day, there was a cold storm coming on, and it indicated there would be cold weather, and therefore they would have trouble flying the shuttle in the cold weather. And they had a stubborn hatch bolt that just wouldn't work. They went out there and hacked away at the icicles, and the hatch bolt held them up. So for a few days preceding the liftoff, there were news clippings. January 25th, there's a picture of the team getting ready for the warm-up. They said they'd leave tomorrow at 6:36 a.m. This is on Saturday, ready to take off on Sunday. Then Saturday also there was a story. The weather could delay the classroom. That had to do with Dakar, Senegal, where they would land, or Casablanca. Then on Sunday there was another delay, and Los Angeles described how 600 teachers and 4,000 students would be watching the launching because of the public interest in this particular teacher. But it went on to say NASA officials were taking no chance of marring a safety record that has been, they've seen 24 shuttle missions fly 52 million miles. And there's a quotation from Jesse Moore, NASA's chief of shuttle operations. "We're not going to launch this thing and take any kind of risk because we have that schedule pressure. We're going to continue to abide by the flight rules that we've always established in the program, and we'll sit on the ground until we all believe it's safe to launch." That was on Sunday. There was pressure to go up, but he wasn't going to do it. By Monday, January 27th, there were articles in the newspaper. Space agency officials scrubbed a launch yesterday because of poor weather. They were anxious to succeed today. This is Monday, because a cold front is expected to bring launch-threatening low temperature to the area tomorrow. Low temperature is launch-threatening, and they described the anticipation and the crew getting ready to get in. But also on Monday, they said the crew had trouble getting a handle off the hatch. They were forced to drill out a stripped screw. The hatch had been scheduled to be closed about an hour or 20 minutes before launch, and they were having trouble with that piece of machinery. On Monday, another article that I have describes the stubborn bolt and the delay in the takeoff. Although the weather was perfect on Monday, the problem with the hatch started an hour before that, and it wasn't resolved before noon when the workers used a hacksaw on the bolt containing the late delivery of tools. Then a drill came with a dead battery. Then broken drill pits came, and what was described as a comedy of errors was taking place while strong gusts of wind were coming across the runway. And Launch Director Gene Thomas said at 12:30 p.m. on Monday that a third weather postponement was coming in it had in many other flights, and that they would have to be very careful because Central Florida was having a hard freeze today. That was Monday. The temperatures will be in the low 20s, and Launch Director Bob Slick said this could cause a problem with water lines on the launch pad. The workers were unable to remove a frozen bolt that holds a hatch handle that is not needed in the flight. They called for this portable drill and hacksaw and so forth, and they worked on that on Monday, so Tuesday morning they were ready to go. Tuesday, January 28th, the bolt has been fixed. The time for the shuttle is ready for the blast-off. The launching would be attempted at 6:38 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Now, I woke up at 7 a.m. Pacific Standard Time to hear on CNN that the launch had been scrapped, that they weren't going to send it up that morning. I really couldn't care less. I went back to sleep, but I'm not the only one. Only CNN carried that news. 3 other networks didn't cover the launching. They didn't think it was important enough. I went back to sleep, and when I woke up, I made a telephone call and was talking to Betty Phillips at the tape center, and she said, "Did you hear what happened? The shuttle had blown up." Now, in the article about the attempted takeoff at 6:38 a.m. for Tuesday morning, next to it is a box, "Reagan address to be on radio and TV tonight." President Reagan's State of the Union address will be broadcast by major radio and television beginning at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. So the launch would take place at 6:38 a.m. The president would be speaking in the evening, and this is very important to pushing the launch off that day, because it turned out, in fact, that he was talking about Krista McAuliffe and his teacher in space, and he was using her identical to the way Hitler used the Hitler Youth to get the young people in America wanting to go up to the space, funding what we've already done, $22 billion in space programs. And little do these children know how much is taken away from their education, their higher education, from the enrichment programs in their schools and communities, from the low salaries for their teachers, and the strikes, of course, with the teachers not having salaries, and the problem of the president addressing himself to the future. And I'll go into the president's speech in a few moments. It was to happen, a short speech, just 20 minutes, because there isn't much to say about this country that is really going broke and financing these crazy shenanigans at this terrible cost. But it was supposed to take place at 6:38 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. At 7 Pacific Standard, it was told not to go, and the truth was that Rockwell had told them don't fly because of the ice. Now, that is the day that the ship blew up. That same morning, Dan Rather was on CBS. This was Tuesday morning, shortly after the explosion, and he was asking questions of an expert from NASA. Very quickly, they had to fill airtime, and they interviewed this man. And Rather said, with a look at the slow motion of the video, some observers, not NASA, said it seems the explosion may not actually have happened in the solid rocket booster itself. And he points out different parts about the main fuel tank from which the explosive material is located, and is discussing part of the machinery. And he holds up a little model. All of the newscasters had the model of their little spaceship, the shuttle, in their hands. Evidently, they run their evening news with that. And he said, perhaps you can see by the close-up that there are seams in the big tank, in the main fuel tank. There is a seam here, he held up the model, and a seam here. I videotaped the whole day news and then played this back and tape recorded the sound so I could type it up verbatim for you. Now, the explosion, to some eyes, seems to have occurred on this part, with an explosion on the main fuel tank itself. Isn't it cute how Dan Rather, within hours, he could figure it out, and it wasn't hard for me to figure out as soon as they got into the discussion. He said, in Florida this morning, it was 28 degrees Fahrenheit scale. Did that have anything to do with the ability of those seams on the main fuel tank to stand up? And the person he was asking said, "I'm sorry, we have a communication problem. I didn't hear you." So Dan Rather repeats the question, and the audio was off before. He said, the question is, would the low temperatures, 28 degrees, in Florida in the morning have affected the seams on the main fuel tank at all? And the answer from this official was, that is one of the things we're going to be taking a very, very good close look at here because of the low temperature. It did, in fact, the temperature did drop below 28 degrees. This is a crucial temperature here because that is when the icicles begin to form. And when they are forming on the shuttle gantry, there is a possibility, a strong possibility, that some of the icicles could have formed in this connection where the main shuttle fuel tank, the fuel tank itself, that brown-looking tank you see right there on the launch pad, there is some concern. We saw a lot of icicles at the base of the launch pad about an hour before the shuttle lifted off. So we don't know if they are actually on the engines on the launch pad of the launch pad itself. The main concern, of course, is if there were any icicles on the shuttle or the solid rocket boosters or on the main tank itself. That was CBS, right, fairly early in the morning, Dan Rather. Now, the next day, there was an interview, a press conference with officials from NASA. And one of the questions was for Dr. Graham, William Graham, who was the acting head of NASA. Question, I've been told that Rockwell saw the pictures of the ice at 29 degrees temperature yesterday and was concerned enough about the picture to call for a delay in the launch. The chronology was that Rockwell saw the launch and said delay it. That's why it was delayed at 7 a.m. That's what I heard when I woke up. It was delayed. Then they went out an hour later, and the conditions were the same, and the temperature hadn't dropped. And they flew an hour later with the same conditions. It actually was delayed 2 hours because there was trouble again with the bolt or the door, one pieces of the machinery. And it was delayed because of the weather first, then the machinery, and then they went on out at the end of that second hour and flew off to about 1 minute plus in air and blew up. And the air was the same. So Rockwell had said, don't go the first time. And they had sent a clear message, don't go. And then the big question, of course, that I'm leading up to is who told them to go ahead, because on Sunday, the head of the agency was saying he won't bow down to pressure. Who told them to fly, and why was it important to fly if they weren't going to bow to pressure and if the ice was the same as it was when they said don't fly? It's just that simple. So getting back to this press conference, the person said, I have been told again that Rockwell saw the pictures and asked for a delay of the launch. Did you receive such a call? And if so, why was it not acted upon? And Dr. Graham said, I will refer that question to Jesse Moore. Again, he's the head of the space agency there. I will refer that question to Jesse Moore. And he took the mic and said there was a series of technical problems, of technical meetings yesterday morning about the ice on the launch. Now, the ice was a source of concern, and they did have meetings regarding the ice on the launch. The ice team went out in the inspection early in the morning, very early in the morning, and that's just when they were ready to take off, about 15 minutes before. And they came back and reported. And he says they reported, but what they reported is don't go. That's why they didn't go. They said don't go. Then he said a technical team did sit down. This is an hour later. All the NASA people involved, as well as the contract team. And we did feel the conditions at the launch pad were susceptible to launch. Now, he leaves out the Pentagon, and the Pentagon is important, and the Air Force, because they were running this whole thing from Washington, D.C. This is part of the Star Wars space in using space for warfare operation with the teacher as the cover, hiding behind the petticoats of this lovely teacher mother, etc. So the team at NASA, he said NASA and the contract team involved, not again the Pentagon or the Air Force in Washington, D.C. And they decided that conditions were susceptible and basically recommended that we launch, whatever that is. We basically recommended, they did, that we launch. In addition to that, there was a follow-up activity initiated yesterday, that's for Tuesday, prior to the launch, very close to the launch. We sent the ICE team out 20 minutes before the launch and basically checked again about the ice conditions, and all reports back from the team were good. Then he said, I'll refer this to Dick Smith, part of NASA, who wanted to add to it. And Dick added to that question. He said it was very thoroughly assessed, the ice question. Indications were that there was very little risk involved. Very little risk involved when the day before Mr. Moore was saying, I will take no risk. I will take no pressure. Why would they go up taking their chances with very little risk, except that evening Ronald Reagan's going to give a speech about his teacher in space, Krista McAuliffe, and try to ignite the imagination of young people to forget the farms, the closing banks, the domestic operations, the cost of education, of health, of housing, the war in Central America, and the mass takeover of mafia in this country, of the banks and of the streets. The kids should look to the future, and the president will go on to his speech, was going to give his speech that evening, that very same evening, and there was a mystery guest who was supposed to sit next to Nancy Reagan. And the big question about the guest of honor, it'd be very interesting to know if it was supposed to be Krista's husband who would be sitting there while his wife was orbiting in space. So they took it up, according to NASA, with very little risk, which doesn't rule out absolutely no risk regarding the ice. It was the ice problem. Now, along with that press conference, there was another question about the ice that was avoided very nicely, and this came out on video again. This was January 28th, the day of the launch, and they were asked, they said the matter of inquiry, the intriguing question, was about 20 minutes before liftoff. The video pictures show ice formation. And was there any concern, they were asked, because you can clearly see it all over. And the answer was several times NASA said that the formation on the ice on the shuttle might cause damage. And they must have had a reason, because they kept bringing up that weather and cold weather would hurt the launch. And NASA said it might cause damage. That's why they delayed the launch. Then they went on to say, the same person, the contractor people were not concerned. Rockwell, who made the plane, the shuttle ship, I call it a plane, it's not a plane, it's a shuttle, space shuttle, they were concerned. And then the man answered, we were aware that Rockwell sent a note to delay the launch. They will not confirm, the NASA now will not confirm that this letter was sent to them, but they're aware that it was. Now, just today in the newspaper, February 3rd, San Francisco Chronicle, a summary of, they're coming to quick conclusions on what happened, because the other parts of the machinery that went many times before, even though with some trouble, were not the problem. It has to be reduced again to the ice problem. And today's newspaper said, new turn in ice shuttle probe, and they explained that there were basic questions about delays in the shuttle system and the speculation on the failure of a seam in the perimeter of the booster. Now, those are the seams that they talked about that would tear if the ice were on them and let the fuel in, and it would therefore explode, that these seams couldn't hold it, and there were pictures of those seams, and they were directly linked not to the malfunction of other parts, but to flying with the ice on it, that it would break the seams. And in the article in the San Francisco Chronicle, it lists some of the questions that they were asking NASA. And the very first question is, why were there no provisions for visual monitoring of the launch from all angles with instantaneous display to mission controls? So in the discussion of the icicles on the TV and on the radio, there was the factor that there were icicles on the other side that they couldn't see. The camera only photographed one side, and they're asking, how come you didn't have cameras on all the sides so you could see what was there, see before it takes off? And the truth is that there were icicles hanging all over that place and the rocket as it went up, the shuttle, and they were down below at the bottom, and the fuel expands when it is frozen, and it goes from 1 degree up to 5,800 degrees in about a second. It's supposed to go, and the pieces of icicle can break off and cause the seams to rupture. So within a few days, it didn't take long for them to say, we'll fly again, the seams broke, and that's what happened. But nobody's going to bring up how the seams broke. There was a story, Los Angeles Times, January 28th, that same morning, frigid air poured into the heart of Deep South, threatening Florida crops and so forth, and icy air is rushing from the Arctic into the Southwest, and they went up in spite of it, even though they admitted all along it could be dangerous. Now, as soon as the shuttle was exploded, January the 30th, that was 2 days later, there were many good articles, particularly in the Los Angeles Times. There's one titled Space Program to be Affected Until the 1990s, which it won't be, and it lists 3 possible causes of shuttle explosion. 1, icicles formed on the main fuel tank might have dislodged, puncturing the main fuel tank and letting hydrogen escape. Another possibility is a ruptured seam in the huge liquid tank may have leaked hydrogen, causing the flames near the boosters visible in videotapes. There could have been enough heat present around the shuttle to ignite the hydrogen, and it might have ignited the motors. Now, those are discussed here as possibilities that happened, and they were 2 days after it went up, but no mention of the fact, even though there are many articles on the icicles, no mention of the relationship in the bulk of the material that came out. Some articles have mentioned the icicles as a factor. The same article says some federal and private experts said that Congress, in a wave of sympathy for the space program, may approve the construction of a replacement of the Challenger. That project will take years and cost billions and sap much from NASA's budget. They have already spent $2.2 billion on this particular ship, and that's what it would cost to replace it. The Los Angeles Times had another article the same day, but by a different person, Thomas Mao, a science writer for the Los Angeles Times, and he writes, a leading theory is that the main fuel tank ruptured, allowing hydrogen to flow out. And this is along the same lines the hydrogen could have been ignited by the heat generated. The rupture itself might have been caused by an icicle dislodged during the flight by a collapse of the bulkhead in the main fuel tank that separated the hydrogen and liquid oxygen and so forth. Icicles were formed on the shuttle from condensed water vapor during 10 hours of below freezing weather that preceded the launch. Officials from NASA and Rockwell International, the shuttle's manufacturer, inspected the shuttle immediately before launching. That was at 6:38 launching that was scrapped at 7 a.m. At the press conference Wednesday, Moore was asked, and this goes to what I just read his answer, asked if Rockwell had asked that the launching be scrubbed because of ice problems. Moore said again that the inspection, NASA and the contractors were satisfied that there would be no significant hazard. And one NASA source said the worst we expected was that the ice might chip off a tile or two. But that wasn't the worst. They said that they would go up and really take a chance. They were reasonably safe. It might take a tile, but that isn't why they put off these flights when they have problems of weather. It isn't because of 1 or 2 tiles. It involves a lot more. Another article in the San Jose Mercury, scientists speculate on why the disaster. And it goes into the various theories of what happened. And rocket and expert Don Myronik of San Jose University speculated Wednesday that a chunk of ice overlooked by a ground crew might have broken off the shuttle and sliced through the umbilical fuel cord carrying hydrogen and oxygen from the main external fuel tank. If there was that piece of ice, it would have shaken loose at the point where the shuttle is reaching the speed of sound, and when vibration is strongest, a large hunk of ice breaking off at that point would have been potent for cutting the cord, mixing the fuel, and creating the explosion. So there was the concern early in the morning. There always is concern when it takes off in this cold weather. They thought the day before they would have to shuttle it because of the weather. Rockwell was asked about it, and so the big question is, who ordered them to go with the ice on? There's pictures of hunks of ice on, no photographs of the other side, but the side you see, it's filled with ice. So somebody very important, and it's limited. These men in the press conference said that NASA and the contractors decided it was fairly safe, but somebody in Washington, and it probably was somebody who was edging Ronald Reagan on to his speech that evening that would praise and raise money for Star Wars defense, for shuttle, for rockets, for offensive, first strike, World War III. That's what it's all really about. I'll take a 1-minute break now and come back to some more about the launching, the icicles, and the story of pushing this. And I believe the reason for pushing it was because Ronald Reagan had a speech that night, and he wanted to be talking about his teacher, Krista, and have an upper so that people wouldn't think about what's happening here on Earth. This is Mae Brussel, and it's side 2 of World Watchers. In case you missed the first half, some people pick it up just in the middle or 1/3 through the broadcast. It's program number 739, and I'm talking about the shuttle that blew up this week and what I think were the causes of it blowing up and who was behind forcing it to go up, even though there were orders don't go with the icicles on, and the spaceship did go up with the icicles, and it blew up in less than 2 minutes. It was gone. San Francisco Chronicle has an article with an interview with William Dillon. He was one of the teachers that was chosen as a finalist who wanted to go up in the spaceship. And he said, I was shocked that they launched Tuesday, to be quite honest with you. Wearing his white blazer emblazoned with the NASA insignia, surrounded with models of the Challenger, Dillon said, it was common sense that if it's below freezing and the rocket temperatures are far in excess of 1,000 degrees, it's just not a good mix. Another story in the San Jose Mercury, Wednesday the 29th, the day after the explosion, has a long story, but then there's a section, weather factor discounted. Suggestions that the unseasonably cold weather at Cape Canaveral might have played a role in the accident were discounted by the NASA officials, who asked not to be identified. He's saying this is all hogwash, of course, but I'm not going to put my name to it because later if it turns out to be ice, I'll look like a fool. He doesn't want to be identified, but he says that's not it at all. Liquid hydrogen and oxygen are far colder than winter air, and all the tanks and plumbing equipment that they come into contact with are sufficient to separate these and to keep them from blowing up, I suppose. He said liquid hydrogen must be kept at minus 423 degrees Fahrenheit and liquid oxygen at minus 297. But that has nothing to do with the fact that Rockwell said don't fly when it's cold, and they didn't have photographs of the other side, but the seams were torn, and that's where this fuel went in and caused the fire. He wouldn't be named, but he said it's not a problem. It's discounted. They referred in this article, the San Jose Mercury article, to the explosion of the German ship, the Hindenburg, that landed in New Jersey May 6, 1937. I don't know how many of you remember that. I was very young, but I remember that, fairly young, 15. And in Los Angeles, over near the Farmers Market on 3rd Street near Fairfax, there's a Pan Pacific Auditorium, and there was a big field. It's owned by CBS now. And the dirigible, the one that used to fly over Los Angeles, had its base there, and it took people up for rides around the city. And the day after the Hindenburg blew up, my father took me over. We were out somewhere, or maybe he did it specifically, but he took me over to where the dirigible was, and he said, I'm going to take you for a ride in that. I guess he didn't want me to be afraid of things such as the Hindenburg blowing up, or maybe wanted to get rid of me. I don't know what he did it for, because he's not like that. He wasn't like that at all. And there was just my father, myself, and a few passengers. And he took me up in this big blimp to show me that the dirigibles are safe. But I haven't been one of them, and I'm not going in the space shuttle either. Some newspaper stories were beginning to play down the icicle story. One large quotation from the Los Angeles Times in big letters said, it is unlikely that any piece of ice smaller than an office desk could have caused significant damage to the casing. But that isn't true. Cold weather was a warning. Cold weather was a threat. Ice was a threat. Rockwell said it was a threat. So they begin to slow it down and make excuses, and the truth is that it is a problem. January 31st, the San Francisco Chronicle has an article, and in there there's a quotation. The accident occurred so fast and with no warning on the instruments watched by the ground controllers. NASA engineers are looking for exceedingly subtle hints of trouble that may lie in recordings of temperature. So temperature is a factor, and the initial speculation was that icicles formed on the main fuel tank as moisture from the air condensed during the 10 hours of below freezing weather that preceded and delayed the launching the first time, and one or more of the icicles might have jarred loose during the flight and punctured a hole in the rocket motor. And this is exactly what they're coming up with, a ruptured fuel tank. In the morning paper, as I say this morning, NASA experts believe rupture caused the blast. The rupture in the fuel tank, called fuel tank, the apparent rupture in the strong rocket casing, and they said had the effect of pointing a torch at the side of the Challenger's fuel tank. Now, the last thing I am is a scientist, a physicist, and I'm not very good at math or a lot of the details that go into figuring these things, or physics, or into hydrogen and so forth, but I know how to read a newspaper and how to listen to things that are said on the media, to hear what they're saying, so that it didn't take more than, say, 3 hours after this thing went up that I was able to figure this out. Now, there was no evidence of sabotage. There's a long article in the San Jose Mercury, January 31st, on all the problems this Challenger has had, and how their first mission in January 83 was postponed, and another one in August 83, December 82, and it runs down problems July 12th, 85, problems with the engine, problems with this particular machine. But the interesting thing is that they said the vehicle's third mission in August 83 came within seconds of a disaster when the lining of the nozzle on one of the two solid fuel boosters almost burned through. But August 83 was the time of the Korean airline, and this was the space shuttle that we had set up, the Challenger, that was flying over simultaneously when the Korean airline left Anchorage, Alaska, and was blown up inside the Soviet Union, that was doing spying for the United States government and testing the alert systems of the Soviet Union that brought down Larry McDonald. This is the same spaceship Challenger. So I guess the karma came back, and this time the Challenger went down, and that was the spaceship that was, as I say, simultaneously. Now, the Korean airline was 007 was supposed to leave and go to Seoul in South Korea, and Jesse Helms and 35 members of a congressional committee went ahead of Larry McDonald. He went alone, Larry McDonald, president of John Birch Society of Western Goals, with the pilot of the president of South Korea, and they were going to do this big spy mission and were knocked out of the sky. But their plane was synchronized for when the shuttle would be over there, and they were testing and photographing other parts. This was a war machine shuttle straight through. Incidentally, they compared the searching of the material here for pieces of the airplane, which in fact, if parts were found, would show what kind of a spy machine it is. I have no doubt about that. And the Los Angeles Times has a story, it had one January 30th, just this last week. The search for clues in the debris promises to be a difficult task. Government investigators agree that this search may prove at least partially similar to the investigation after the 1983 shooting of the Korean airline flight 007 over the Sea of Japan in the crash of Air India, which later they brought the parts up in the black box and showed that had been bombed. In the KAL incident, the United States spent more than $22 million searching for the wreckage and the flight recorder, around 3,000 square miles of water, looking for pieces of the airplane. $22 million looking for pieces of the Korean airline so that the Japanese or the South Koreans or the Russians wouldn't be holding in their hands the absolute proof of the spy information, although they had it on tapes. This was the physical evidence, and our government just throws his money away. No wonder we have such a tremendous debt. So this was the same Challenger that went up in August 83, went down this time, and again was going down on, it was a great spy plane, and Reagan was using his teacher. Now, Reagan was very saddened, of course, by this machine going down, and he wanted civilians in space. This was his idea. There's a story in the San Jose Mercury, January the 30th, 1986. According to Mr. Schmidt, Senator Harrison Schmidt, CHMITT, and other sources, President Reagan was anxious to open space to civilians and personally announced his Teacher in Space program at a Washington Awards ceremony August 27, 1984, honoring secondary schools. Before Reagan's decision to choose the first citizen passenger in the history of our space program, a teacher, NASA intended to send a journalist first, and I think it's going to be Mr. Cronkite that goes up there as the journalist. The Reagan decision occurred amid his political campaign in which his foe, Walter Mondale, wanted to rally teachers against the president. The president had cut federal aid to education by 25%. So, according to Schmidt, NASA and the White House realized it would be politically wise and logically to work with the educational community first, since children are the future, and a great deal of the momentum behind the space program, they would be the ones pushing it. So he decided to have the future in the hands of the children and pulled the announcement just at the time of running against Walter Mondale, August, the 27th, the end of August, and the election was in November, that I'll put a teacher, so you teachers vote for me, and then the teachers could push the space program with the students and get them all interested, similar to Hitler's youth. Now, the speech the president was to give last Tuesday night, according to the LA Times, would be very brief. The State of the Union would be very brief, and he was having a fight with his staff members on what to include and what not to include, but it was going to be a thing about American family, strengthening the American family. And I'm sure that Krista's husband would be the one sitting next to Nancy, beaming the husband, the wife, and the little children, and she was going to humanize space and show how great that was. Another story in the Wall Street Journal, Hero Hour is near, and Reagan won't talk about it until tonight. An exemplar for the nation would be hard to locate. Last year there were some, and it mentions people that he's had next to Nancy when he announced a Hero of the Week, the Hero of the Year. And as I say, it was a top secret. He wouldn't say who it would be, but I bet his face really fell. And he had to take the momentum because there are so many things going wrong in this country at this time. We can't even list them in 10 hours. And look to the future. And the future is the space. The future is Star Wars. That's the number one thing on the agenda, on their schedule. And here was his teacher that he promised. And Reagan identifies with John Kennedy. John Kennedy said, I'll have a man on the moon. And it was there. Reagan said, I'll have a teacher. And this blast-off couldn't be delayed. It was delayed 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, and then the eyes came. And somebody, as I say, in Washington, had to say, go, take a chance, because they were willing to take the chance to send it up, even though the icicles were the same. The speech was written, and that old goat can't rewrite a speech that fast. You know, if the ship were on the ground, the space shuttle, and he's giving a speech, you know, to say that it will take off, it wouldn't be so dramatic to have Krista's husband, Mr. McAuliffe, sitting next to Nancy. It would be much more romantic and dramatic, and there's nothing else to say, so he was going to go to the future and reach up to the firmament and hold everybody in their spell. San Francisco Examiner had a story. Reagan's not likely to address the depressing reality of the country, and it goes into the problems and so forth. President's challenge to Congress that he's going to lower the domestic spending way down. It has to go $200 billion. The deficit is $200 billion, and it has to be lowered, and he doesn't want to touch his military. And today, Casper Weinberger was asking for a 100% increase in the Star Wars budget. So Ronald Reagan was particularly involved in this teacher and the synchronizing of the space being up in the air while he's giving his upper speech. January 29th, LA Times story said, Krista McAuliffe's fate seemed especially distressing to Reagan, who had surprised the space industry and the political world during his 1984 campaign by announcing that he had directed NASA to search for a teacher to become the first citizen astronaut. Now, who was the teacher, and what is Ronald Reagan's love affair with teachers? Other than being political, you have to go back to his early ideas about education. For you long World Watcher listeners, approximately 200 82 broadcasts ago, 5 years ago, broadcast number 456, I was talking about Ronald Reagan's running for governor and how it paralleled Claude Kirk of Florida. In the 1966 elections, he and Kirk got together. Kirk was the first Republican in Florida in 94 years. He was engaged to a German woman living in Brazil. Reagan was running against Pat Brown in California. So from Florida to California, they were running a campaign to break the back of the University of California, and immediately after the inauguration, Reagan fired Mr. Kerr, the president of the University of California. They met for lunch January the 13th, 1967, and Reagan met Claude Kirk in Los Angeles. As soon as the elections were over, they were inaugurated. Then Kirk flew to L.A., where their financiers and manipulators were, and met with each other. And the very next day, January the 14th, Clark Kerr, K-E-R-R, one is Claude Kirk, the head of Wackenhut Corporation, who does the security for the space stations and for the military. Clark Kerr, the former president of the University of California, he was fired. He was told no pay, no notice, and he was dumped. His goal when he was president of the University of California was a college education for every person in California. And I asked the question going back, way back, a long time ago, about Ronald Reagan saying that fascism does away with the educated, that we're going into a fascist state, that they need a handful of experts, scientists, computer programmers, and management, and a lot of slaves, that education stirs too much trouble, education should be for the rich, you should skim off the minority and the poor white. If you want to look into the Los Angeles Times or New York Times story, The Curiously Divided Life of Clark Kerr, this was October the 9th, 1973, and I mentioned it on that broadcast, 456, that Kerr was a major force behind the 1959 California Master Plan for Higher Education, which assured every high school graduate in the state an opportunity to obtain higher education, also assigned various educational tasks to different segments of the academic research, and trained all the PhDs while the state colleges would concentrate on undergraduate work. In 1966, the gubernatorial campaign of Ronald Reagan criticized Mr. Kerr for being too lenient on the students there and the protesters and so forth, and he met with the Board of Regents, and this tells how he went ahead and fired Mr. Kerr. And starting January 67, the regents met. Kerr refused to resign. He was fired by a 14-8 vote. And then conservatives who long opposed Kerr were joined by Governor Ronald Reagan, including his strong allies. One was H. Robert Haldeman, later in jail because of Watergate offenses, and Alan Grant, president of the State Board of Agriculture. Another article from that era, Kerr warns of college plights in 1974. A long while later, he was saying that the country would take away support for higher education and it would be a matter of mere survival. People would be living from one day to the next, and that's exactly what Ronald Reagan did. Going back to an earlier article I have in Nation magazine by Fred Cook, the wonderful writer, Governor Kirk's Private Eyes, and this is about Claude Kirk's working with the Wackenhut Corporation, the CIA, the FBI, with George Smathers of Florida. He was best man at Kennedy's wedding and introduced Nixon to Bibi Rebozo to make those connections, and it tells about the Wackenhut growing as a security for NASA, for the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, for the Atomic Energy Commission, and other federal enclaves that pour millions of dollars into Wackenhut, and Claude Kirk formed that and worked with Ronald Reagan in breaking our educational system. If you want another early article, New York Times, January the 8th, 1967, Florida's governor set up private police force, and this has to do with his intelligence operations in the United States. Two big policemen, Ronald Reagan and Claude Kirk. So the idea that he wanted a teacher in space was a political gambit. It was an excuse or a ploy to hide exactly what the space shuttle is, and it is for Star Wars, for land launching space stations, for future genocide like Alternative 3, and this teacher went with it all the way. The Los Angeles Times had a story about the plans, well, maybe you saw it in many of your papers. The plans for, as I say, 600 teachers were to attend the launching. They did, and 4,000 students from around the country were to watch the launching. Now, they had 600 teachers out there at the Space Center in Florida in that freezing weather, 4,000 students, and they couldn't delay it for the fourth or fifth day. They were all waiting there. And as I say, the orders went up. Rockwell said, don't fly with this ice. They knew that by Sunday that if it was cold on Monday, they'd have trouble on Tuesday. And it was getting colder, and the ice was coming in. And they were told it was a hazard, but they had the children there, and this one article, and you've seen many of them, from her orbiting classroom, she will teach 2 lessons that students in hundreds of schools will watch from public broadcasting service, and she will make a demonstration film to distribution schools. The space agency wanted to get her up there. They were anxious to get her up there so that she would help raise money and promote the package of the school system, encouraging children to look to the future, to look where they can't see or get, and forget what's on the ground, how their cars eventually will fall into holes in the road. The Los Angeles Times had a story before the blast-off January 27th. Shuttle fever grips nation schools. Westwood Elementary School science teacher is scrambling to find a satellite dish to install on the playground so the students can monitor the journey of Krista McAuliffe, the first teacher in space. Students in Mitchell Elementary School are luckier. Video Satellite Communicate donated an antenna to watch the shuttle. The antennas will give the students the ability to watch the broadcast from the space shuttle throughout the day. Educators believe the historic flights to begin today are a valuable opportunity to bring first-hand experience of scientific research into the classroom. To help promote Teacher in Space classroom activities, the Los Angeles County Office of Education mailed to local schools 3,000 copies of a curricula package developed by NASA so teachers could integrate the mission's activities into their lessons plans. One of the lessons is where we've been, where we're going, and why, to help students understand what is going on. Another story, the news meet invades Concord, going to the students and checking out their grief and involving these students in this particular operation which Ronald Reagan wanted. Now, as for Krista McAuliffe, it is so disgusting, the promo that's been given about this poor woman wanting to go in space. There was a long interview about her, another one from the LA Times. They did a particularly good job. She said her husband wanted recorded for posterity that she take along her prized possession, his class ring from Virginia Military Institute. Not his wedding ring, nothing like that, but she took along for history the ring that he had at a military school. She said she wanted to teach history of ordinary people, and this is what smacks of fascism of Adolf Hitler. Forget Wall Street, who was funding him. Forget where the money comes from. Reach the masses, the children and the babies. She wanted an ordinary view of history. She's a history teacher. She wanted to teach them to get interested in space law and space business and prepare for the future, the new frontier. She linked her trip into space to the journey of a pioneer woman in Conestoga's wagon and how she planned to teach her experience to televised classes from space. Now, this Conestoga wagon cost $20 billion. The space program has put $20 billion into this. And forget this, an isolated incident of a woman with her military ring of her husband going up there to tell the poor schnooks around the country that they shouldn't look down at their feet because they don't have shoes to wear, and don't look at the roof because it's leaking, and don't look at the hotel you're living in because there's no housing. But she was going to promote for the agencies the money and the enthusiasm, and knowing that it's a military operation, she said that she's not interested in the large things of history, that she was the first ordinary citizen to be chosen, just a school teacher, and she'd go down in history as an ordinary person. This wasn't an ordinary trip, and I get so tired of this BS, and that's all it is. It's a hunk of BS. You know, that one little trip to launch it is $50 million. To replace it is $2.2 billion, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. My great-grandparents came around the Isthmus of Panama from France or England, and nobody paid for their buggy or their ship. She's no great pioneer. Before she went off, there was a gift of a $1 million insurance policy for her and her kids. And she wrote up in her resume how she wanted to go out and explain to people and give lectures and have conferences. And her goal, when she was asked what she would do, as an educator, she would go on this exciting prospect with national, regional, and state educational conferences. She would disseminate information. She was a propagandist for people to get hunks of money with no noticeable reward before planet Earth is fixed up. They're telling us that we got digital watches from space, and I heard a whole program on what we got. So we have digital watches. There was nothing wrong with the old-fashioned watches. We could tell time by them, even use the sun. For goodness sakes, it's so ridiculous. She would go, over 4,000 educators, she said, attended a seminar at the National Social Studies Conference in Washington. She would attend these. She would go to annual conferences. She would meet large audience lectures, small personal workshops. She'd make videotapes and lecture on this. They asked her what she would do. How would you share your experience? Well, there was a lot of fringes to go on to this. This wasn't a thing that she would lose anything on. You'd lose your life, but she took the risk, because if you came down, it was big bucks from then on, doing everything she wanted to do. Mr. Borman of the space program became president of Western Airlines, or Eastern Airlines rather, and he's going broke now. I couldn't manage it. It's not the same as what he was educated to do. And Senator Glenn, he was from the space program, but all of them got books, movies, lectures, and a lot of fringe benefits that go on. And somebody, as I say, just handed her $1 million insurance policy. This isn't a pioneer. The pioneers that came across this country in their little covered wagons, nobody bought their horses for them or the blankets that covered them. This was a major operation. Just last night I was reaching for a certain book on my shelf and pulled out the one called Hitler's Youth. And it's called The Duped Generation, and there's a picture of the young blonde boys with the drums on the cover. It was published by Ballantine Books under the section of politics, book number 6, that series. And the young boy there reminded me of the young youth in space that was interviewed on Larry King's program, for all the world looking exactly like those Hitler Youth. And on the back of the book it says, boys and girls were thrown together by crises. This is what happened to unite the spirit of these people, by fear and belief in their country. And that's what Ronald Reagan sells to us so well, belief in your country. But with nostalgic view that must appear came the memories of victims and the innocent and the appalling misuse made of the youth's idealism and the spirit of self-sacrifice, worthy of a better cause than that which the Fuhrer offered the youth of his Germany, his youth, the appalling misuse of their idealism, not to get them to make a bridge from this city to that city, not to work on rapid transit like they're putting in Europe, or subways all over the world that we don't have. San Francisco has, Los Angeles doesn't have. Pollution, getting rid of the spoils with Environmental Protection Agency is running out of money. The sky is polluted. The water is filthy. The fish have chemicals and mercury. Earthquakes happen and no one can rebuild, these appalling catastrophes that happen. And then the masses are pushed aside and the multinational take over. The idealism and the spirit of the president pushing this at this time, it's his 5th year in office. He was going to give a speech. The deficit is something he promised the balance of budget to take care of. The deficit is horrendous. 5 years after his speech promising all this and getting elected for those things, balancing the budget, it's worse than ever. He thought, I'll drop the taxes and raise the cost of the military and the foreign aid and the Contras and the Angola freedom fighters and the Afghanistan freedom fighters. And America is identical to what Herbert Hoover was doing, where all the money was getting ready for the next world war. And this is what Ronald Reagan is doing. So he has to look to the future. And the future is in the space where they will beat, or hope to beat, the anti-Russian, anti-communist mentality. And they have to get the children swayed. If it went up, it was a success. That would be his speech, and that was going to be part of the speech. And if it goes down, we've made these sacrifices, so in their name we have to go up again. And that's the way he does it. Now, the crew was a military crew. Francis Scobie, the commander, was Air Force mechanic, entered the flight school, worked in the Air Force, has been an astronaut with the shuttle planning the next stages of Star Wars. Michael Smith, longtime military Navy commander, got his degree at Navy Postgraduate School out here in Monterey. Ronald McNair, degree in physics, MIT, and so forth, Ford Foundation Fellowship, worked with NATO, all military. Gregory Jarvis, captain in the Air Force. He had maintained the rank of captain. He was an engineer at Hughes, working on this kind of activity, spaceship and tests for the fuel tanks for the Challenger. And Mr. Onizuka, same thing, laser specialist. Judith Resnick from Carnegie Mellon, electrical engineering with NASA, worked for Xerox, all military people. It was a military crew except for the teacher. And behind the petticoat of a woman teacher with a husband and children at home, the perfect American family, teaching from space, normalizing space. That's what she was supposed to be doing. Traveling with 6 military people who are testing weapons, setting and preparing for World War III. Taking her husband's military ring, not his teddy bear, but his military ring. That was the significant thing. She wasn't anything but a military woman. He's a lawyer, went to a military school, and goodness knows that maybe an attorney for one of the agencies. No doubt he was, and she was selected to be the spokeswoman. Give us your money, give us your savings, give us your debts. Let's get on up there. That's the future. America's being bankrupt, and the president had to give the speech that night. Somebody in Washington said, go ahead, the icicles are still there. Take the chance, because he's not going to get a speech like that in another year, and the budget problems are coming up now, and he wants the budget for the space and the Star Wars, and they took the risk. The risk didn't work. They found the seams that broke. The icicles could break the seams. The ship went up. They'll get money to make another one to go down because the American people are suckers, and they'll give it to them. Well, this is Mae Brussel, and I'll be back with you next week with some more disgusting news. Sorry about that, but it is pretty bad.